Some of these parents of trans kids, they basically get ostracized sometimes by their family members because they think, oh, you should just sweep this under the rug. We don't want this kind of disturbance in our family. They can't go to some of their churches that they used to go to. It's really hard to come out as a parent and testify and be put on Front Street in this way. Some of these parents, their kids don't want them to talk about this. They don't want to be out in their community. So it definitely takes a toll on folks to come out and talk about this issue. And when the issue or the supposed problem they're trying to solve is a fake problem, yeah, it's super frustrating.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Over the next week, I will be releasing a series of episodes on transgender rights. Today, our guest is wildlife biologist Aaron Poe, who is the father of a trans girl in the Anchorage School District. The inspiration for this trans rights series is 3 bills currently moving through the Alaska State House. One, which bans trans girls from playing girls' sports. One, which requires kids to get signed permission slips approving their preferred name and pronouns. And one, which allows doctors to be sued up to 20 years after treating a trans youth. Alaska has many big problems. The pressing need to increase the funding of our public school system and finding a solution for an imminent energy crisis. But instead of working on these very real, very substantial problems, we are spending the last weeks of session debating whether trans youth exist and have rights. They do exist, they do have rights, and over the next few days, we'll be hearing from them and their families.
Aaron Poe, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to be here. And I should totally qualify. This is actually the first podcast I've ever been on. So I hope I do okay.
Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. I was born in Colorado. We moved around a bunch when I was a kid. So lived in places like Washington State, Utah, Michigan. I think I figured it out once that we lived in 12 different houses before I was 18. So we definitely bounced around a lot. I moved to Alaska to take a job with the Forest Service in 1998. So I came up here to be a wildlife biologist in the Prince William Sound, Kenai Peninsula sort of area. So basically I've been here for going on 26 years or something at this point. So maybe a reaction to my moving around as a child. But yeah, my wife moved up here in 2000, and we have 2 kids in the Anchorage School District system here that have been here since, the kids were born here. So they've been in the schools their whole lives. We have 2 teenagers, 2 daughters, one that's 17, and then our youngest, who's 14, and she's a trans girl. So that's what kind of brought us into this world.
Can you talk a little bit about how you found out your daughter was trans and what that experience was like?
Yeah. She came out to us in, I guess when she was like 12-ish, she started to basically be interested in looking a bit more feminine. She liked the idea of they, them pronouns, which I will totally admit was like hard for us to get used to. But over the course of about a year, she basically came to this conclusion that I'm a girl and I'm going to be a girl and be a young woman. And it wasn't easy for us to understand those things. Of course, both my wife and I started doing like a bunch of reading and what's this about? And is this a real thing? And is this just a phase? Which I think is pretty common. I've come to learn we're connected to a pretty awesome group of parents who also have trans kids. And so it's just everybody's experiences are obviously a little bit different, but there's definitely some commonalities in this where unless you have experienced this yourself, it's easy to maybe sit back and be like, that's not a real thing. That's just a kid trying to get attention. But until you have experienced it yourself, you just don't know how fundamental it is to their being. And it makes you reflect back on things. Earlier, the same kiddo, we'd go to the beach on vacation or we'd go to a motel with a swimming pool, and she would always want to wear a top, like some kind of, and when we go to Hawaii, we're like, great, yeah, it's a sun shirt. You need that because you'll get sunburn if you don't have that. But I get really frustrated when we're like at the hotel at night and it's like, it's dark or we're inside an indoor pool. You don't need to make another shirt wet to pack into the bags to fly home tomorrow. And just never really thinking about why was she wanting to cover her torso all the time. Or similarly, she and I would go out camping or we'd be at a cabin or something. I'm just like, go pee off the porch. Like, you don't have to walk all the way to the outhouse in the middle of the night. Honestly, there's bears and moose out there. Like, why are you putting yourself at risk? And of course, these many years later and knowing what we know now, that's not what girls do. Girls don't pee off porches. So yeah, no, it's interesting about how fundamental it was to her growing up, her identity, even though she didn't really know how to express it till she was, in the kind of preteen age.
When your trans daughter, age 12-ish, started using they, them pronouns, did you or your wife ever think that there might be a way to stop the process that was unfolding? Did you think that you could get some counseling or something that might make this not happen the way it's happening?
I think we weren't sure at the beginning that she really wanted to be a girl or that she really was a girl. So our first thought was, and this gets into some of the medical aspects of it, is there's something you can take called hormone blockers that will delay the onset of puberty so that this person has a little bit of a runway to figure out. Because in our case, it absolutely wasn't our reality. This is a young woman who knew she was a young woman from a long time ago and just finally figured out how to express it. But there probably are cases where, and I'm sure there must be, where kids need some extra time. Think about how confusing, I don't know your experience, but for me, being a teenager and just all that onset of hormones and social expectations and all these kinds of things, it's a confusing time. And so we did, at the beginning, we're like, oh yeah, maybe blockers is a way for us to allow this person to have some more time to figure out who they are. And I don't know, it's interesting to think about that question, whether I ever wanted it to stop or I didn't want her to become what she is. I don't think I ever thought about it that way, actually.
I know some parents have talked about having to mourn the expectations that they had for their child that have suddenly changed. For however many years they thought that they had a son and now they have a daughter, and they'd fantasized about what that child's future would look like, and they had to completely abandon that fantasy in some ways because of the transition. Did you feel that way?
Yeah, definitely at first. And I think my biggest concern was about her safety, right? Like, I'll just put it out there and own it. For better or worse, as a white man rolling through our society, I get a lot of deference from people, right? And it probably is for the worse. And if she had that, if she stayed a boy and became a young man and whatever, she would have an easier, safer life. So I think in terms of, for me, the mourning was more about fear and worry for her safety and for what kind of quality of life is she going to have if people might be doubting her or she's doubting herself, right? If she isn't feeling safe and secure in our society, what kind of life is that? I think that's more where my concerns or my anxiety or my sadness, just to put it really plainly, came from, was that loss of safety for her.
One line of thinking that some folks have expressed in the Capitol during some debates over some trans bills recently is that trans kids are trans because of pressure from their parents. Do you feel like you or your wife ever pressured your child to be trans?
Oh man, of course not. Yeah, of course not. No one wants their kid's life to be harder and more anxiety ridden. I mean, that pisses me off because, I mean, look at the stats, right? 1 in 5 trans kids attempt suicide. Do you think anybody wants that for their kids That is just such BS, man. I can't imagine the twisted mind that comes up with that.
Speaking of risk of suicide, did you guys explore counseling, or what was the first step when your daughter began this journey?
Yeah, definitely pediatrician counseling for us. Yeah, no, it definitely rocks the world. And you, as a parent, you want to be doing the most that you can. And fortunately, we have insurance and talk about real problems that people in the state have. So we could go and see specialists to understand or try and understand what's going on. Yeah.
And did your pediatrician that you had since the kids were little, was it the same pediatrician? You didn't have to go find a special pediatrician? Did you just go to your regular one?
Yeah, that's where we started at first. And then they referenced us to gender affirming care opportunities. Yeah, just again, to understand what are the sort of likely future scenarios and what are things that we can do or things that we shouldn't do.
And did you feel like you had adequate resources in Anchorage for your daughter?
Definitely not. There's a good clinic here, and we're certainly blessed to be connected with them. But there was a long wait time, super long, like many months. And as parents of teenagers or whatever, maybe if you've had teenagers, you remember puberty comes on real fast. And so there was this kind of anxiety of, oh my God, are we going to be able to get in and get care before this kiddo develops in such a way that it's more difficult? And a number of folks here in Alaska, and actually I should totally put this out there, in Anchorage, yes. In Alaska, the rest of the state, there's like nothing. So we're blessed to be able to be in this bigger city where there are some of these services. But there's a number of Alaskans that have to travel outside. They have to fly to Seattle or fly to California or whatever, back east or something, to get the care that their kids need. So yeah, it's definitely it's a deficit situation.
So you spoke about the privilege of being a white man and how, in a way, your daughter giving up that privilege was something that, you thought about and mourned in a way. I guess I'm curious about your child's experience before coming out as trans, and where they are today. Do you feel like their experience in school and society has gotten worse, better? Just talk a little bit about what that's been like.
It's a hard question because in a super objective way, of course, their life is harder and worse, right? This is a kid that played basketball, played soccer, and now she can't do that in Alaska schools because she doesn't have the freedom to join the girls' basketball team or soccer team. So that's an objectively less good experience for her. She's afraid of being outed in some sort of public way. She's afraid when she's around people that knew her when she was a boy and now she's a girl. So she's afraid of like how to interact with them. So there's a bunch of aspects of her life that are a lot harder and a lot worse. But at the same time, I don't want to sit here and mourn my happy child's existence because despite all of this, she's still a happy, compassionate, wonderful person that has awesome friends and lifts up the people around her. So it's hard to say that, oh, her life is bad because she is figuring out a way to make it good. And we're doing what we can to help with that. But in terms of opportunities to whatever, even something as basic as get scholarships because she can't play on high school sports teams, there's definitely aspects of this. And yeah, the fear and anxiety that goes along with being outed as a different gender. Or we have family in Utah where they're looking at passing, you can't go to these bathrooms. And so we're like, how do we go visit the grandparents if we can't go to the freaking bathroom at the 7-Eleven? There's just like stupid stuff like that makes life objectively harder.
Did you keep her at the same school or did she change schools after she came out as trans?
Yeah, we were really fortunate in that she came out as trans in between the 6th and 7th grade year. So she was able to move from her elementary school to a different middle school. And so she basically showed up in that middle school as a girl. And there weren't people there. So I never heard her talk about it, that knew her from when she was a boy.
Gotcha. If it's okay, I want to talk about the sports thing a little bit because that's definitely a hot button issue in the Capitol right now, and I guess in the country. And what I'll say is that we have folks who are progressive, who want to support trans people, are allies of the LGBTQ community in most every way, but they will say, I do not think it's fair for trans girls to play girls' sports because I believe that they will win and it won't be fair. And that's just not coming from the right. That's not coming from the far right conservatives who are pushing what seems to be a more blatantly anti-trans message. But that's coming from folks who, in every other way, want to be supportive. What do you say to that?
Yeah, no, I guess it comes down to, what do you think high school sports are for? If a person thinks that high school sports are to grow the next generation of NFL athletes, Olympians, then maybe that is a concern. But I guess that's not what I played high school sports. I didn't do it because I thought I was going to go on to the NFL or, I played it because it was a way to hang out with friends. It was a way to demonstrate that I could work as a team. It was a way to learn to be responsible, to take direction, to lead, like all of these kinds of person development kind of ideas. And so I hear that, and sure, of course, conceptually, that makes sense. But I guess the reality is, as far as I understand, this has never happened in Alaska where someone got excluded from some kind of economic or prestige opportunity because a trans person beat them out at X, Y, or Z sport. Like that, it literally just doesn't happen. And so it makes me really question, what are the motivations behind this, behind making these rules? Because again, if it's for the 1 in 300,000 person that is not going to go on to get a bronze medal in the 2032 Olympics, I guess I don't care about that as much as having kids that grow up in Alaska have opportunities to demonstrate their ability to be on teams, to gain friends, etc., by playing on high school sports teams.
This is a very subjective question, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you think if your daughter were playing basketball and soccer, that she would unquestionably be the best player on the team and would beat everybody else?
No. And the fact that nobody can point to an instance of this happening in Alaska, I don't know why this is an obsession. And frankly, it feels like it's cloaked. It's cloaked for hate legislation, right? It's supposed to cause fear and intimidation, and it's supposed to control women. So it feels like a smokescreen to me.
The way I have framed it in my own mind was that if this was really just about protecting cis girls from potential unfair competition, then it could be argued and spoken about in a respectful way towards trans girls. And it's not. In fact, in our hearings, folks talk about how trans kids do not exist. And because trans kids are some sort of fiction, they are not entitled to constitutional rights and protections. I think if this were really about protecting cis girls, there would be no need to speak so disrespectfully and unkindly about trans girls. But that's not the way this is being presented. So for me, that's really where it comes down to.
Right. Yeah, no, and I guess, on that same kind of point, just the hypocrisy of these folks saying that they're doing this to protect women. Give me a break. Like you're
Right.
protecting the women that you're taking reproductive freedom from. I mean, it doesn't add up at all. Make it make sense for me.
I
If
hear
you want
you.
to protect women in sports, give them more access to sports. Give them better access to like better training for coaches. Like give them better access to facilities. Give them better access to travel support. Like there's so many other ways that are so much more important than let's eliminate the 9 trans girls who might ever be collegiate competitive that come out of our entire state. It's just nonsense.
Another one of the bills that has been debated in the last week is the governor's House Bill 105, which is about a lot of things at this point. But the part that seems to get the focus is the permission slips for children to use their preferred name and pronouns. And I guess in that vein, can you talk a little bit about what your daughter's experience is in school right now?
Yeah, she has a really good school and a really good principal and good teachers that have always been supportive of her and frankly of the other queer kids at their school. Both of our daughters go to the same school. And again, in a lot of ways, we feel really blessed to have found this little bubble in an Anchorage school that she feels safe and she feels supported and feels like she can be herself. And a lot of the other kids there have the same experience. So we're really lucky for that.
The other bill that got a lot of debate last week basically makes it so that a person who has a gender affirming procedure performed on them as a minor has 20 years to sue that physician for surgical regret. And I've said it before, but it bears repeating over and over. We actually don't have these procedures being performed on minors in Alaska. We actually don't have them being performed on adults in Alaska. Again, I guess if you could talk about what the experience is like to have this bill taking up space in the legislature and getting focus in the media.
Again, these kind of nonsense issues. Like you think of, look at all the challenges that Alaska has right now with funding our schools is probably the biggest, most obvious one. But look at the degree of lack of infrastructure and lack of support for rural communities. Look at the way that we marginalize the Alaska Native experience across this state. There's just really fundamental problems that are actually worth talking about, whereas we're making rules for things that don't happen. And again, and maybe it's just because I'm so frustrated at this point, I don't really believe that these folks believe what they're talking about. They're just doing this to punch trans kids. And I don't know why that's what they're focused on, but they really just want to marginalize this already marginalized community. And I guess one of the things that's really frustrating, both my wife and I talk about this, is it's really hard to sit there and watch some of these legislators parade these so-called experts that they dredged up from somewhere in the lower 48. These people aren't doctors. They aren't human physiology specialists. They aren't psychology experts. They're not even Alaskans, right? And so we have to spend a bunch of time listening to them talk about this issue for some reason. And then you contrast that with how hard it is for a parent or a trans person to stand up there and say, no, I do exist, or my kids do exist, and they are real, and they deserve to feel safe and supported in our state. Some of these parents of trans kids, they basically get ostracized sometimes by their family members because they think, oh, you should just sweep this under the rug. We don't want this kind of disturbance in our family. They can't go to some of their churches that they used to go to. It's really hard to come out as a parent and testify and be put on Front Street in this way. Some of these parents, their kids don't want them to talk about this. They don't want to be out in their community. So it definitely takes a toll on folks to come out and talk about this issue. And when the issue or the supposed problem they're trying to solve is a fake problem, yeah, it's super frustrating.
Have you had any issues with extended family or friends from before, coworkers, anyone who has distanced themselves from you because you are an advocate for your trans daughter?
We've been super lucky. And I don't know why exactly that we haven't had folks specifically distance themselves from us or question us or any of that. But, and again, it's really been really interesting to be part of this kind of parents group, just to hear the diversity of experiences, because there's definitely folks that they've had to change jobs, or they've had to, again, stop going to a church that they've gone to for years just because it's not comfortable there anymore, because they're standing up for their kids. Right.
Right. Another thing that I think you've touched on is that plenty of parents of trans kids are not able to show up at hearings and testify in defense of their children for a variety of reasons. And I'm very grateful for those that do. But one of the arguments lobbied by a sponsor of one of these anti-trans bills was that we're hearing the same parents show up at hearing after hearing. It's the same people saying the same thing over and over. And the implication there was that they should be disregarded, that this wasn't meaningful testimony because it was the same parents that had showed up to testify at the previous anti-trans bill. And of course, that to me is just makes me very angry. Their voice is important. Because you brought forward multiple anti-trans bills doesn't mean that these parents can only testify to one, or that their testimony is somehow less meaningful because they are saying that they love their trans kid twice in the same week because we have two different anti-trans bills in the same week.
Yeah, no, it's definitely frustrating. I myself have not testified at a hearing yet because I have to work during the day. I literally cannot do my job and sit on hold for 2 hours, again, listening to so-called outside experts from places like Idaho that are not doctors, they're coaches or whatever, talk about this. Like, I can't do that and do my job. Right? If the legislature wants to start doing testimony between 6 and 9 p.m. or something, I can do that. But and I imagine that's probably the case for a lot of people. It's not easy. And so again, I'm super grateful to the parents who do show up every time. And yeah, they should show up every time. The idea that you're going to come out and support your kids, these like basically recycled, hate-filled bills, you're going to only do it once, that's just nonsense. And it's ironic, again, because when it's some other issue, school vouchers or whatever, they're happy to hear from the same people time after time if it's something that they're in support of. Opposed to it, we got to start marginalizing those people.
I do believe, I've alluded to it already, that there are plenty of folks who want to be able to ask questions about this, but feel afraid that their question will seem insensitive. They're afraid to ask a question that might offend somebody. I just think that we've created an environment where it's really difficult for folks on either side of the aisle to talk openly, comfortably about trans issues, particularly trans youth. If there's anything that you want to say to those people.
Yeah. In some ways, I wish there was a way to do this, because I would walk a lap of the park strip downtown with anybody on my lunch hour. 30 minutes, you could ask me anything you wanted. I would love to do that for people who are genuinely trying to understand. It does get exhausting to talk about it, but I would do it because I think you're right. What's missing is the ability for people to understand that trans people have always been part of humanity. It's not something new. It's not something trendy. It's just that, fortunately, this country feels maybe just a little bit safer, that trans folks can be out and be more proud and be more visible. When I think about through my work, I'm fortunate enough to work with a number of folks from various Alaska Native communities. And they're like, and their term is two-spirit people, or at least a lot of indigenous communities use this term of two-spirit people. And they're like, those people have been with us forever. And a lot of languages, indigenous languages in Alaska, don't have gender type pronouns because it's just not, it isn't this big binary thing that's being held up. I do think there's a little bit of it, like people can do some individual learning on this. And And it's not that the internet is always the easiest place to get your information. You can Google how, what gender identity is, like how it's determined. I'm a wildlife biologist. So I'm a scientist. I have that background. I actually didn't know until a few years ago that it's much more about brain chemistry than physical attributes. And I think people maybe need to try and do a little work on their own, do some reading of kind of qualified places or listen to some podcasts or something from doctors, psychologists, physiologists.
Do you have any in particular that you would recommend?
I knew you would ask me that. And I can't pull them off the top of my head.
If you text me, I will add them to the show notes. And I'll just say that there is some danger in somebody with no background in this just Googling. I have done that because I, as I said before, I am not an expert on trans issues. I'm an accidental trans advocate. And I myself have gone down some rabbit holes of Googling, particularly the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, Norway, the UK have revised their policies with regards to trans youth. They are not as, I guess, liberal about advising that folks use puberty blockers or hormones for minors. And I think that some of the conservatives have latched onto that. And there's lots of writing that will appear extraordinarily objective if you don't know any better, when it's not objective. They're making gross overstatements that the scientific community in Europe has reversed course. And I don't know if you can speak to any of that. You probably have looked more at that literature than I have, but I know that if you don't know any better, you could end up reading some articles that basically make America seem like a crazy outlier in terms of the way we are doing transgender medicine for youth.
Yeah. And I guess my recommendations are more specific to like understanding that like your body's physical presentation does not determine gender identity. There are plenty of science papers, the World Health Organization. And maybe this is because maybe my perspective is biased because I am a scientist. I'm able to go to Google and be like, this is a scientific paper. This is somebody's uncle that is trying to make a spin point. So yeah, in terms of I think it's much more complicated around the gender affirming care aspects of it. But I think a basic thing that would be really helpful if people understood is that gender identity is actually baked into your brain. Like it's part of your brain. It's what's between your ears, not what's between your legs. And I'm sorry that I didn't know that until 4 or 5 years ago, because I happened to listen to a podcast by an intersex person. And I was like, I had no idea, how did I get to be 45 years old and not know that gender identity wasn't a physicality thing. It was a brain chemistry thing. Yeah. So that's more what I'm speaking about, is that it would be nice if somehow everybody could go back to their human physiology textbook that they had in 7th grade and be taught this.
100%. Hey, any last words that you'd like to leave for my fellow legislators who are potentially debating these bills in these last couple of weeks of session?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I have a hard time just understanding where this is coming from. People talk about how in Alaska, we have this kind of self-determination and people get to be who they are and the government stays out of their business. Like this is this whole meme that we hear all the time from proud Alaskans. And yet in this case, we got to get all up in people's business, like literally in their pants, to figure out stuff, to know what things they can have and what things they can't have. And I don't know where that comes from. And I guess I would just ask people who are so certain that these things are necessary, like, why are you doing this amidst all of the other things that are hugely challenging for our state? Why this? A similar question for my Christian friends. I grew up Catholic. I'm a Christian myself. And why are a number of kind of Christian communities latching onto this issue? I just don't understand that. Again, lots of religion in my background. I know that Jesus never spoke about trans people. And if we track back to the fact that trans folks have always been here, always been among us, there's certainly would have been an opportunity for him to say something about this if this was some big, important issue. Instead, he was more about being kind to one another, welcoming a stranger, that kind of stuff. And so I guess I don't see from a values perspective of Alaskans should be free to make chart their own courses, from a value perspective of love your neighbor and support them. How did this get here? Where did this come from?
Aaron Poe, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew. It was a good conversation. I appreciated it.
Thank you so much for listening. I have dropped a link in the show notes to a podcast about gender recommended by Aaron Poe. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call our office at 907-465-4940.